Morning, Mike. All right, I think we hit the 30 participant number, and I think that's going to keep going up. So I think we'll get started because we have quite the agenda today, and I wanted to make sure we have time for questions as well. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to our April Land Use Coordinating Committee meeting. I want to take a moment to acknowledge, because it's hard to believe, it's been one whole year. In fact, last month was one whole year. I was looking through the agendas for LUCC since we started doing these meetings virtually. And unlike last April, though, when I feel like we were still coming to grips with the mayhem caused by the pandemic and adapting to being remote, I feel a lot more hopeful uh, this time in 2021, heading into the summer, hoping that we can have a more normal summer, and also more importantly, seeing many of you in person, hopefully before the end of the summer. Now, while I miss seeing you all, I will say that one of the biggest pluses of this virtual learning environment and meeting environment has been the access that we now have to exceptional individuals from across the country. And just scanning through this past year, we have invited folks from California, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and now we're adding another state to our roster this morning with Johanna Gilligan joining us from today. She's in New Orleans, but she's living in New Mexico. And where I was gonna say if she was joining us from there, it would be 7 a.m. right now, which is a lot of commitment to join us. So Joanna, thanks for being with us today. Now, in terms of the topic today, it is partly an extension of the conversation we began at our Land Use Coordinating Committee meeting at the beginning of the year. If you may recall that meeting, ARC began the process of creating a small business anti-displacement toolkit, guide, resource that is still sort of something that we're working towards. Um, Commercial gentrification, as you know, we understand, is happening across the metro, much like residential gentrification, and in most cases, it is also leading to the loss of our local culture and history in some cases. So while we work towards figuring out how to help stem this loss and how we also should take the time, I thought to highlight some of the great work that is happening in our region and in other parts of the country to both protect and enhance the cultural and historic resources that we have. Because I know we all can use some inspiration, positivity once in a while, and that's what today's meeting is about, to hear some great stories and hopefully take some inspiration back. Now, with that, I wanted to take a moment to introduce the four speakers that we have today. So, and that's them on the slide, but I think you can see them on video as well. But first, we will hear from Doug Young at the City of Atlanta and Blake Howard with Matchstic. They will talk about their Future Places project, which is, again, the first, I believe, comprehensive assessment of the City of Atlanta's historic preservation program that came out of the Atlanta City Design. And if you haven't, you should go to the website atlfutureplaces.com to learn more about this work. It's a great website. I was looking through it a little bit this past week, and I must say I love how it says at the outset that if we don't recognize, respect, and protect Atlanta's past, it will be forgotten. And if we don't incorporate the past into Atlanta's future, it will be lost. So really looking forward to hearing from both of them about that work. Second, we will hear from Melissa Jest, who is with the state's Department of Natural Resources Historic Preservation Division, and even more specifically, a program coordinator with the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network. Melissa will be providing us an overview of the network and the most recent initiative building a better network. So thanks, Melissa, for being with us as well. And lastly, we will hear from Johanna Gilligan, who is with Homewise Inc. now, a nonprofit that works on both residential and commercial redevelopment in the New Mexico area, Albuquerque and Santa Fe, with, I believe, the overall goal of strengthening neighborhoods and retaining the cultural identity. And in her role, Johanna works on redevelopment projects that have a catalytic impact on the community, attracting new investments, while also making sure that the existing residents and business owners are able to benefit from that as well. So again, like I said, a great list of panelists. I am looking forward to hearing from them. And so I'm going to get out of your way. I'm going to turn it over to Molly to go over some housekeeping items. And then from there, we're going to hear from Doug and Blake to kick us off.
Good morning. Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Sam. I'll be brief because you've all heard this many times, but we want to go over ways that you can participate. First and foremost, and I think the one that most people are most comfortable with is using that chat function. We'd love for you to put your questions and comments in the chat function throughout today's presentations. You don't have to wait until the end. And one thing we'd really like to see is if something sparks an idea that you have had for your own community or something that you've actually already implemented, go ahead and throw that in. We'd like to really share what we're doing in our own communities with each other so that we can learn from one another. Secondly, at the end of each presentation, we'll do a little bit of Q&A. And if you would rather speak rather than putting your question in the chat, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll call on you and then you can ask your question or provide your comment at that time. A little housekeeping as far as if you're having any technical difficulties, we find that if you just log off and log back on, that tends to fix most issues. If that doesn't help, go ahead and try to download that desktop app. We find that that tends to be a little bit more stable. But if you continue to have issues and you can't chat with me here, I appear as the ARC Community Development. You can email me at mbogle@atlantaregional.org, and I'll throw that email in the chat right now. And with that, I will pass it to Doug.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for coming today. And I appreciate you all listening to the work we've done here at the City of Atlanta. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So once again, my name is Doug Young, and I'm for the City of Atlanta's City Planning Department in the Office of Design. And my focus here at the City of Atlanta is managing the city's historic preservation programs. And as Sam mentioned before, we're going to talk about the Future Places project. It's a tag team presentation with myself and Blake Howard, who is an integral part of the consultant team to create what we thought was a new way of talking about and discussing historic preservation in the City of Atlanta. As Sam mentioned, this was the first comprehensive analysis of the city's historic preservation program in over 30 years, since the time we had actually created the current structure we use in the mid-1980s. Let's go ahead and get started. Next slide, please. So as Sam mentioned, this is an outgrowth of Atlanta City Design, which is our vision document for the City of Atlanta. And I wanted to emphasize here a couple words in this phrase, which is the word progress and the word meaning. And to note that in the City of Atlanta, particularly in city design, as well as in our new thinking about historic preservation, this idea of what has meaning is integral to having appropriate and sustainable progress in the City of Atlanta. Slide. So that leads us to the Future Places project. And I will allow Blake to talk later on about how we came to this name and how we came to this idea of the new branding and new logo that you'll see throughout this presentation. But suffice it to say that this was a really important endeavor for the City of Atlanta to undertake. And we actually started this conversation really probably 4 or 5 years ago with some folks in my office sitting around one day and really asking, why do we go through all this work about historic preservation? We know what we're doing and we know how we do it, but the question is, why are we doing it? Next slide, please. So really, in essence, the Future Places project is an initiative to ensure the city retained its historic identity. Slide, please. And if you look at the facets of the city's history, those themes of the city's history, it's really important to understand that there's a combination of properties and people and stories and places and spaces that make that up. You just see a small snippet of the variety of that kind of history and culture in this montage here, but the reality is these future places are our current places that we hold dear, want to make them sustainable and be around in the future. And in this slide, you see there's a whole variety of those kind of locations in the city of Atlanta, both because of the events that occurred there, such as the lower middle portion showing Dr. King speaking at Hurt Park, to the upper right portion, which is the Pratt Pullman site, which is now the site of a really interesting urban redevelopment project. Slide, please. So what is the Future Places project? I think there's a couple points here to highlight. One is we did engage the usual folks in the conversation, but the most important takeaway, I think, from this slide is that we wanted to ask new people new questions. We had been asking mostly the same people the same question for many years, and not surprisingly, we were getting the same answer, which certainly was helpful, but it wasn't really what we were trying to accomplish here, which is trying to get a roadmap for what lies ahead. What is the next 30 years worth of historic preservation work in the city of Atlanta? What does that involve? What is that? What should be the priorities for the city of Atlanta? Slide, please. So why do you do something like that Future Places project? As we mentioned the last time with the 1980s, as you all know, it's continued today, the rapid physical change in the city of Atlanta. It's really overwhelming a lot of the conversations about neighborhood futures, about corridors, about what's important, what's significant. So we need to take a pause, if we could, and figure out how those decisions and those decision processes will fit together. The other important thing I'll mention here is that one of the things we were trying to push back against was the city's brand. As probably most of y'all know, the city of Atlanta is very much focused on a forward-looking, new, bigger is better, shiny is better than dusty kind of mantra. And it's our assertion that that's one way of approaching the future of the city of Atlanta. And we would argue not the most sustainable way to approaching the future of the city of Atlanta. And so by talking about the city in a different way, we thought that was important for folks to understand that, and as a way to also address lots of myths about the city of Atlanta. And all of this is in much more greater depth on the website. We really focused on that, but there's all sorts of great information, and Blake will touch on a little bit of that with his conversation about our survey and outreach work. Slide. So what do we have when we were done? We, of course, had reports. We can't have a planning project without reports. But I would note that none of these reports were printed in any mass scale. The only one that was printed with limited copies was the call to action. Everything else lives on the website. We have a couple file copies for reference, but we had a couple focuses. One was on our Parks and Recreation System survey, we'll talk about later, public participation, peer city analysis, and so forth. But I think the two key takeaways here is the project website and the project video, which we really hope to show you at the end of our segment. I think Blake has that queued up. So it really captures the essence of what this project was about. Slide, please. More importantly, though, when we were done with the Future Places project, I put done in quotes very importantly here, is we had more questions than answers, which was actually what we expected to have going into this, because we weren't really doing the project to find or document the city of Atlanta history as an academic exercise or even as a research exercise. That was not the issue at hand. The issue at hand was questions about partnerships, about new tools and techniques, new conversations, and new priorities, and having that roadmap for the next 30 years. The lack of information has not been the issue with historic preservation in the city of Atlanta, generally speaking. Next slide, please. I wanted to touch on a couple of quick items here, particularly because they help really describe the project well. We did do a more traditional analysis of the city's parks system, including a parks system history, as well as individual park assessments. There's over 350 units in the city's park system, from the famous parks you're familiar with to lots of small parks and neighborhoods and what have you around the city of Atlanta. But the most interesting about the park system we found is that it actually is a synopsis of the city's history. It really captures the ebb and flow of the themes in the city's history, and is a great example, because it's in all parts of the city of Atlanta, how those history and themes are interwoven geographically and over time. The city's park system has fascinating stories. It has stories that are well known, stories that are not well known, and at the same time has all sorts of physical geography and characteristics that, again, embody the city's history. Slide, please. We did a relatively traditional data gathering windshield survey work, but we did not survey the whole city of Atlanta, nor were we intending to survey the whole city of Atlanta. The areas you see in purple here were actually the neighborhoods we focused on, mostly because they had not been looked at closely in years past, or had been a long time since they had been looked at closely. So the areas that are not in purple, we certainly don't know all the information about necessarily, but we have something on file, either us, I should say, or ARC or other agencies, that give us a sense of where we stand as far as documentation in those areas. So we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. We didn't need to go back and resurvey the King District or rewrite the history of the King District. That's all relatively taken care of. So this was about trying to fill in some of those gaps. Next slide, please. And then really the other important option here was telling the story of Atlanta. This is not a history of Atlanta. It was never intended to be a history of Atlanta. The question here was, how do we summarize what is the essence of Atlanta into 4 or 5 easily digestible and easily described themes? And you see those here. And on the website, there's a very short story of each of these themes to help folks get, if you will, acclimated to what is the essence or the DNA of the city of Atlanta. Again, not trying to write a history of Atlanta, partly by the fact that it's been done by multiple folks multiple times, but more to capture the essence, that DNA. Slide, please. The other item we did is we created a call to action, slide please, which is our list of recommendations. But unlike what you might find in other planning documents, all of these recommendations are written in what we think to be regular English. They're not categorized by operational items. They're not categorized by agency assignments. They're categorized by what they actually would accomplish. So hence these categories or these titles about what we think they will actually do for folks if they were to go through them and see how they could be useful to them or their community. This is the only document we printed in high volume. And when I mean high volume, we only printed 200 copies of this document. It's a small booklet, maybe about 10 pages front and back. Next slide, please. Then as Sam noted, we had one of our great taglines here, which is, if we don't protect Atlanta's past, it will be forgotten. And if we don't plan for Atlanta's future, it will be forgettable. I think the key takeaway here before I throw it to Blake is that this is a forward-looking, future-looking project. In our view, the city's history and historic places and spaces are valuable because they are part of the future, not part of the past. And with that, I believe next slide, we can turn it over to Blake.
Perfect. Thanks, Doug. Let me get my slides up here. Great. Thanks for having me. Excited to share. You know, I'm an outsider to this world. I work for and run a branding agency. So we help organizations define who they are and how they express themselves. And we are not preservation experts. We are not planning experts. So we had a little bit of an advantage in this project. We have worked with the Department of City Planning for years, and most notably worked with Commissioner Keene on redesigning the zoning signs for the city. So we understand a little bit of the context, just enough to be dangerous, but we also represented sort of this outsider perspective, which I think was really important in this work. So we have a little bit of a mantra that we had predefined for the Department of City Planning that should apply to all of their communications, all of their brand work, and certainly to the Future Places project. And it's this idea that they should be clear, because to be clear is to be kind. And what I find a lot of times, not just in city planning, but in any technical field, the communications tend to be very technical, which is not very kind. It's off-putting and not approachable. Acronyms, technical jargon, things like that don't feel inclusive to outsiders that aren't in the field. And so we felt like this project, one thing that was important was to make sure that we kept this mantra front and center. So when Doug reached out with the opportunity to work on historic preservation, we were very intrigued and very interested. And as we got a little bit of a download from him and the team and the rest of the consulting group, our first question was, who cares? Who cares about this? Who is this really for? Is this for the technical experts, or is this for sort of a persona that we have predefined that we call just the unengaged resident? Are they the ones that really need to care about this? And as we discussed it more and more, we realized that this initiative was less about creating a name for an initiative or a project for the city, and it was more about reshaping the perceptions around historic preservation. and helping people understand the value of historic preservation, because we felt like, the everyday person doesn't necessarily connect why they love a space or a building, or why they feel like they want to go to Ponce City Market more often than not. And a lot of times it's because of the history of it. So how do we connect those dots a little bit better? So as we first started with who cares and who is this brand for, this initiative for, we did have some predefined personas that I'll run through really quick. We actually have 4 for the department, which made this question pretty efficient. We said, is this for the unengaged local who is not a technical insider at all? They really don't understand the technical jargon. They really don't understand preservation. Or is this maybe a little bit more on the right here for we called this the next generation developer, someone who understands the vision of the city and they want to align their developments with that vision. We also have a couple more that get even more technical, but we felt like these are the 3 that we really wanted to focus in on. And we said, the unengaged local, we want them to understand that the preservation work is creating a unique and vibrant city. And that's why they love certain places that they do. The hopeful resident was a little bit more about understanding how the process would protect their neighborhood and their stories and their neighborhood identity. And then the next generation developer, they really just wanted a clear strategy so that they could manage expectations for development. So we got clear on who this was for, why this would matter, and why they should care about historic preservation. And then we wanted to understand, more of what do we want them to think about historic preservation. And we our process, we tend to workshop this, and we just believe, we're experts in communication and branding, but then we need to partner with those technical experts like Doug and the rest of the consulting team to understand some of the technical components so that we can translate that into a simple message. So in that process, we really came out with this idea that we wanted people to think about historic preservation in Atlanta as the key, not to preserving the past, because that's how we typically think about preservation. It's all about protection and a defensive mindset. But what if we could reframe it to be the key to designing our future in balance, this future that would allow us to sort of hold progress and equity in balance, a future that would be true to Atlanta and what makes our city unique, a work that could be inclusive for the betterment of all residents, and this idea that preservation is an equalizer for everyone. That was pretty powerful. And a good design really is going to require a balance of intentionality, a harmony of old and new, of brick and metal, of green space and pavement, of legacy and new residents. We really liked this idea of designing the future in balance. So we kind of honed in on that as being a core idea that we would want to communicate in the name, in the message, in the look and feel, and everything that we would put out around this particular initiative. We also did a little bit more of a quantitative look into what do people think when they think of historic preservation. We did 2 studies. I'll share mostly about the general study. So we surveyed 500 respondents, and their demographics generally correlated to the city's demographics. So we felt like we had a good respondent pool to garner some good insights from. And to quickly summarize it, the majority of respondents felt like historic preservation is important. However, there wasn't a high understanding around the topic. And in general, the majority of residents don't actively participate. 66% that were surveyed were not involved at all in civic or social affairs, and only 4% were directly involved with preservation activities. There were some specific mentions that were helpful for the project. Martin Luther King was a primary one cited. Social activism and discrimination rose to the top as historical themes. The Civil War era was ranked 3rd of 7, and then pre-1860 and the 50s through 70s were time periods noted as important. Interestingly, neighborhoods, industrial buildings, business districts, and high-rises were most often noted as being unimportant. And then lastly, there was a sense that archaeological sites and cemeteries topped the list. And what was interesting to us in this is that people just didn't know. They didn't truly understand. Maybe the older an area was, like an archaeological site or a cemetery, then the more important it must be, right? That was sort of the assumption. The second survey that we did was a more technical crowd. So these are people that opted into certain meetings, that were engaged, that were showing up, that were interested. And their survey results were a little bit different from this. They had more specific answers to some of these questions. And so if we were trying to help the uneducated in historic preservation understand more of how it's valuable in their life, then we really needed to start with basic communication, sort of move them to a place where they understood what was most valuable about this work. And we kept that in mind as we went into building the brand. And even as something as simple as the name, this idea came to mind. We didn't want it to be about protection and about preservation. Those things are good, but we wanted to flip it to make sure it sounded valuable, that it's about the future of the city. And we could always pair this name, Future Places Project, with something that was a little bit more specific, like redefining historic preservation in Atlanta. And then as we got into creating some of the brand communications for it, because we had done a lot of work with the department, we wanted to make sure that this was not another logo that looked like it was some new organization that was doing preservation work in the city. We wanted it to be directly visually coherent with the department so the department could get credit for this work. And so we just put together really simple, the concept here was kind of these brick by brick, really simple visual aesthetic that fit well with the rest of the department branding. And then we just brought it to life with some fun swag. If you're going to do an initiative, you have to have swag. If you want the public to be engaged, make swag, t-shirts, stickers, and little things like that really help. But we also gave it a personality, and we wrote some fun lines like "I break for old buildings, keep Atlanta historic, powering preservation." We came up with an idea for the look and feel of the campaign of old and new kind of layered together to help people understand sort of the places they love today were places 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and that the places they love today need to be intact so that they can be places that people will love tomorrow. And you can see a couple more of those images here that we sourced and that we found and we layered together. And then those, became kind of key visual elements for things like pop-up banners. We also focused a lot on the communication aspect. Doug mentioned this, but we wanted to be clear and kind in the way we described this project and not be overly technical. So we just said, the City of Atlanta's Future Places Project is an initiative to ensure that Atlanta retains its historical identity as the city moves forward. Very straightforward, very clear. And then we created additional materials that helped that unengaged local sort of understand what actually will you be doing with this project. And then there's a couple of different images here. You can kind of see some of the lines and the language and the personality, the way that we thought about engaging public via social media, different giveaways, and even social assets here that we animated to help people kind of understand the texture and the layer and to get interested and engaged by this project. And then lastly, I want to close with, and I might have to reshare my screen really quick to make sure I've got audio. Let me click the little button. I want to end, here we go, with, let's see, sorry about this. Here we go. I want to end with this video because I think it's a really powerful way to tell the story. And if you think about a typical preservation initiative, it would have been dry, it would have been defensive minded, it would have been about protection, but instead we presented it like this.
The story of our city is written in the foundations. On the land of the Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek people, inscribed inside the railroad tracks, a city built by the enslaved, the indigenous, and the immigrant, the song of our city lives in the narrative of our neighborhoods, in blueprints and red lines, in trolley tracks and bus lines, in guitar riffs and bass lines. Can we tune in to the rhythm of our city? The heart of our city is found at the corner of struggle and success, how our city is the birthplace of movements for civil rights, for freedom, for inclusion, for all we've achieved, for all we have yet to accomplish. The soul of our city can be found in its buildings, lingering in the very bricks and mortar, how the walls of our historic places speak out to tell us their journey. Will we listen to the sound of our city? The legacy of our city lives in the leadership of our elders, lives in the place where what was then meets now and what can be. We want to honor our roots because our history is our future. Will you help us uphold Atlanta's future places?
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate the time.
That was a great way to end it. I must say that video was pretty awesome. Thanks, Blake. Thanks, Doug. Folks, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. But I wanted to sort of maybe, I think we have a few minutes at least before right now, and I wanted to pose one question, which maybe just globally talks to the engagement of this. And I understand through the ways in which you have talked about this and you marketed this and used social media. The idea is to engage a new audience, which I think Doug mentioned to a certain degree, is to get, you know, the three types of audiences you had mentioned. But curious on the other side of it, within City Hall or within the government of the city itself, the conversations, how have they shaped? Because I know you mentioned, Doug, at the beginning, there's sort of this growth versus the shiny new object versus preserving what we have. That's an ongoing battle. Did this sort of engage folks within City Hall? How did those conversations look like? And is the hope that what you hear from the outside hopefully will inform some of those decisions moving forward?
That's a great question, Sam. I think two things that we learned from this project. One is, and a bit of self-reflection, despite all what you saw in this presentation, it was still a struggle to find new voices in this conversation. Part of that was we had still learning ourselves sort of the tools we had at our disposal to do that, but also there's this barrier of engagement just because, in fact, it was a city project, in my opinion. The folks felt this somewhat invisible or almost visible wall between our meetings, our conversations, you know, how we approach the conversation as city staff. We've gotten a lot of good response from the video and some of the website work because there's not that transactional barrier, if you will, to understand that. So that's one thing. The second thing I'll say about the City Hall staff in particular is we're still trying to push that conversation internal to the city. There's no question about it. I think we have great allies through our neighborhood leaders. Actually, they tend to be the ones who help us get that message across most effectively. But I also think there's a new appreciation of this question of authenticity and equity and uniqueness that folks are starting to appreciate more about, you know, again, the neighborhoods as the building block for that in the city of Atlanta. So that's what we're sort of banking on to continue to grow that message.
Thanks, Doug. And just following up on that, because I think Blake threw some number out there, and I thought I had written it down, which was about like 66% or so of folks are not engaged, do not show up. And I was curious about, like, as an ordinary citizen, if you did hear from those folks in terms of, is there a barrier to entry for them in that they don't know how to engage? Was there part of the conversation they don't really understand how to participate in this process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we heard specifically in the study of why they don't engage, but we certainly had some hunches. I think the level of misunderstanding of what historic preservation is and the value of it is probably why. Like, why would I show up to these meetings when, you know, I don't really need to fight for the old church in my neighborhood. Like, someone else will do that. You know, I think the lack of relevance in the everyday resident's life is the problem. They're not driven to do that. I think we're, you know, I anecdotally feel this. I love my neighborhood. I live in Kirkwood. I love history. I'm actually a little bit of a history buff, but I'm also incredibly busy. So I can only prioritize so many things. And I think if you scale that across a lot of people in the area, that would be the case. You know, that it's just not a top priority, top issue for them. And that was part of the drive and the inside of the work. Can we help make this a little bit more relevant for that everyday local? And if they can just understand a little bit more about the importance of it, maybe we can increase that, or we could decrease that 66%, increase that 4% a little bit.
The other thing I would add to that, Sam, is an important point about this idea of the wording and the message that goes with this topic. One of the things we've when I say we, I mean the city staff have come to appreciate, is that a lot of people do what we would call historic preservation, but they don't call it that. They call it, community development. They call it working with their neighbors to save, the corner store. They call it trying to collect the stories of the elders in their neighborhood. They call it, whatever it is that they call it.
Right.
And so that goes back to my point about sort of the transactional barrier of, oh yeah, come to a city, conversation about historic preservation. I'm like, well, what, first of all, to Blake's point, they are probably busy, but secondly, is that might not even mean something to them. And so part of, I mentioned earlier in my talk that we started this conversation 4 or 5 years ago internally into the staff, was we were sort of doing a bit of soul searching ourselves, which is, why do we do all this work? I mean, it's not, the process of holding meetings and doing reports and so on and so forth isn't, fun in the traditional sense of the word. It's necessary, but why do we do all that? Like, is it just for our sake? Is it for someone else's sake? What's the real outcome of that? So I think this idea of making sure that we listen to folks in using their words in their space, in their places as the vehicle, not have them come to our places and spaces, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah, thank you. And there is a question from Kate Little in the chat, which says, which I think is a great one. And do you think a project like this can help bringing sort of like the gentrifiers, for lack of a better word, and the legacy residents to meet across the divide to foster better neighborhood cohesion?
I'll go first, and other folks, I'd be curious to have them jump in as well. But I think so, because of one of the points that Blake made, which is the idea of the equalizer, of that. I would note that we have an assertion that historic preservation is an anti-gentrification tool in the city of Atlanta. And that's a whole nother conversation we can get into another day, maybe, but we have some pretty good anecdotal evidence that suggests that it's an anti-gentrification tool. But nonetheless, a lot of folks in these neighborhoods are facing a lot of change. Both have an interest in a positive outcome. They might have different values related to that outcome. Generally speaking, the gentrifiers, if you will, are often very interested in location in an abstract way, as in, I'm close to this, or I'm close to that, I'm close to my job, whatever it is, or the coolness factor of a neighborhood. And so what we would assert is that the history of that area is there. They just don't understand that's why it's the cool neighborhood, among other things. So having that information sharing might be a way to bridge that conversation.
Great point, Doug. Blake, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's where I get to stay in my lane as a branding consultant a little bit. But I would say, as someone who lives in the city and would be part of, I've been in the city for close to 20 years, but would be more so part of the gentrifying group than the legacy group. I do think hopefully people that move into historic neighborhoods that are changing the demographics of it, and they're part of that group, hopefully they realize that what they were attracted to has some significance, and that they would want to retain that significance. That they're not moving into neighborhoods that were just built 5 years ago, and that's why they're moving into them. They're moving into them because of the convenience and the story and the texture of the community, and hopefully they would see that as something they want to participate in. And so I think the idea of it being a bridge is fantastic, because you have aligned ideals in that sense, where otherwise you might not have a lot of alignment, perhaps. So I love that idea, and I certainly would hope that this would expand beyond just the preservation strategies, and would have more social implications as well.
All right. I know we'll hopefully have some time at the end for other questions, but thanks for that excellent presentation, guys. We're going to now move over to Melissa Jest, who's going to talk about the DCA initiative. So, Melissa.
That's a pretty hard act to follow. but good morning all, and thank you so much for including your SHPO, the Georgia Historic Preservation Division. And we are newly housed at the Department of Community Affairs. Some of you might remember us being a part of the Department of Natural Resources, but we made that transition during the coronavirus at the end of the year and moving into a new space at the beginning of this year. So, but thank you again for having us here. I'm going to take off my video because I'll be reading my script, so forgive me. But yes, I'm really excited to bring you this information about what new thing we are doing at HPD with an organization or entity that has been advising us for a while. And we use the term GOPIN to describe this advisory group. So next slide. So as part of HPD's outreach office, I strive to serve the constituents in most of Georgia's 159 counties. And in order to do that as a one-person office, I need to engage the network, and that is GOPIN. And GOPIN started out as a small, zesty, committed group of vocal advocates in 1989 who brought to the attention of the then SHPO, Elizabeth Lyon, that there was a major gap in representation in terms of African-American places on the National Register from the state of Georgia. So they were dubbed the Minority National Register Advisory Committee, and they worked to bring information about resources to HPD staff, which was at that time writing the nominations basically, and also working to train and engage grassroots advocates in doing nominations themselves. But along with that particular service, they also had a 10-year campaign to push for the creation of a permanent full-time position at HPD that would focus on African-American resources and increasing nominations to the National Register here in Georgia. And so you see in the upper photo, Charlotte Frazier, the late Charlotte Frazier, unfortunately, we lost her. She started as the very first kind of chairperson of the Georgia African-American Historic Preservation Network Steering Committee. And then below in the other photo, you see Isaac Johnson. He's out of Augusta, Georgia. He took over the role soon after and continued in that role for close to 15 years. And in the center, there is Jeannie Syriac. She was hired in 2000 as the first program coordinator in that permanent position. And then next to her is Ray Luce, who was the then deputy SHPO who hired her. Next slide. So as the inaugural coordinator for this new office, the African American Programs Office, Jeannie Syriac worked tirelessly with that GOPIN committee to take the message of preservation into as many counties as in Georgia that her state car would take her. And in doing that work of outreach, she knew she needed a tool to spread further the message. And so she instituted the Reflections newsletter, which I'm proud to say continues to be one of our major platforms, if not our major platform, for getting information out on the little known yet significant histories centering on African-American life and contributions in Georgia. This work also brought attention to Georgia HPD. It was recognized by the National Conference of SHPOs for being the first to establish a specific position targeted towards African-American engagement and increasing African-American presence on the National Register. And then also this publication brought attention to the SHPO receiving an award for its role in expanding and enriching the historical record. Next slide. So thanks to the Reflections newsletter and Jeannie Syriac's outreach, working with her committee that was positioned in key cities around the state, Augusta, Atlanta, Columbus, Savannah, the GOPIN network grew to about 500 constituents by 2006. And so the committee and Jeannie Syriac worked to start convening those particular individuals in certain locations to train them, to keep them motivated, and to share with them case studies and success stories about preservation of African American resources that were about to be lost or that required some type of wonderful collaboration or innovation, because that's what it often takes to save African American places, spaces, and stories, because they suffer from neglect for so long. So pictured here, you see Velman Allen in the upper photo. She and her congregation at First African Baptist Church in Brunswick hosted one of those very first convenings, bringing people together, again, to keep them motivated for the long haul. Preservation is a long haul. She continues to work to preserve and promote the history of her church. There in the background, built circa 1870s, and she served on the Goppin Steering Committee for about 10 years. So we have a group of very committed individuals that are willing to work over the long term to promote historic preservation to African American communities and to individuals interested in saving African American places, because historic preservation is not seen as an inclusive movement. However, it is the only game in town that we have to help to preserve and promote our stories and our contributions here in the state and in the nation overall. And then another important work Jeannie Syriac did in this inaugural position, working with this growing network, was to establish, or I should say, to create a multiple properties documentation form. I know that's a lot of words, but this particular form, this study focused on Rosenwald schools, particularly the Rosenwald schools in the state of Georgia. Georgia had about 259 schools built in 103 counties over the 2.5 to 3 decades that that particular initiative operated in the mid 20th centuries to bring education to rural Black communities that was steeped in Jim Crow segregation. So pictured here is one of the 54 schools that Jeannie Syriac was able to find in her field search with the help of the network, getting a call from a person saying, hey, I think there's a Rosenwald school in my county. Hey, I think, you know, my cousin might be able to help you find a school that's back in the woods. And so it's a really important work for our office, because now advocates who are familiar with these schools or do find the school will be able to nominate it, because we have that multiple properties documentation form that Ms. Syriac contributed to. And for her very important work in establishing this program office that still operates, in establishing the Reflections newsletter that still goes out, and in helping to grow this network, Ms. Syriac received the highest preservation award from the Georgia Trust, the Jewett Award, in 2012. Next slide. So Ms. Syriac retired in 2015, leaving 5 core functions of this program's office at HPD, and they're listed there. And I came in in 2016 as the second coordinator to continue to manage these particular duties. And thanks to her phenomenal work, the work of that steering committee, and the other constituents around the state, Goppin has now grown to a network of close to 5,000 constituents that are linked through their commitment of telling Georgia's broader story through the preservation of places and spaces. Next slide. So as an informal network, Goppin looked to their steering committee to give them some guidance for the future. You know, how do we continue to grow? How do we improve our interactions as a network? And then how do we prepare to advocate? Because there still is a need to advocate for an inclusive story being told here in the state of Georgia. So fortunately, in the year 2020, while COVID was raging, Goppin received a nod from the National Trust, particularly from its African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. And so we were one of 27 applicants who received a grant, and our grant is focused on capacity building for this network, particularly for the steering committee, which will grow into a board. So this particular group will be working, the board will be working to establish a 501c3 so they can raise funds to continue to support their work, their outreach and their engagement work. And then also we'll be working to create an organizational structure to better engage with those 5,000 constituents that are located both in Georgia and around the country. Next slide. And then also more importantly, to better connect with professionals within the preservation field and to make our constituents on the grassroots aware of human and capital resources within the larger preservation field to help support their work. Now circled here, you'll see Dr. Alvin Jackson, MD. He is headquartered in the Willow Hill community, which is a historically Black community, rural community outside of Statesboro, Georgia. He has stepped up to serve as our chair of the GOPIN board and will be helping to steward through this process of building a better network. Next slide. So you might ask, why? Why build a better network? Why don't fix it if it ain't broke. Well, there still exists a major need to document these places, spaces, and stories in order to tell the fuller story, in order to paint the bigger picture. In 2016, the National Trust for Historic Preservation noted that less than 5% of the National Register listings point to African American history / ethnic history as one of its leading criteria for significance. Here in Georgia, we're inching close to 3,000 listings on the National Register, and only 8%, inching close to 9% of those particular listings here in Georgia note African American and ethnic heritage as a leading part of its significance. Also, the need exists for more eyes open, more ears open, more boots on the ground to tell us at HBD what is out there. As I mentioned, Georgia has 159 counties, and most of them have African American presence, have places, spaces, and stories that tell of our contribution also to building this particular state. And even though municipalities are required to plan under Georgia law, historic preservation ordinances and survey work is basically voluntary. We have 99 certified local governments that do have preservation ordinances and active historic preservation commissions, but even those particular governments struggle when making a decision on where they're going to put their survey monies when they have to survey. I think it's every 10 years. And African American resources across the tracks at the bottom, on the other side of town from their more well-heeled historic districts are often put at the bottom of the list. They're not the priority. And so that survey work, that inventory count of and condition assessments don't happen. One of my very first field trips out to do survey work to assess the condition of the African American resources that we were aware of, thanks to Jeannie's work previously, was out to Harris County to photograph the Bethlehem Colored School, pictured here. The story bench that is so circled in that photo is there so that the church historian or the community griot can share stories about those emancipated elders that built this school at the turn of the century. Next slide. But by the time I got to the particular site, all I found was the story bench. So whomever comes to this site based on the information they might glean from the National Register, they're going to have to imagine the schoolhouse. So that particular property was listed on the National Register in 2008. and it was the only African-American resource of the 14 National Register listed resources in that county. So now Harris County, the community of Hamilton, they don't have a resource that they can point to help deepen one's understanding of Black life or life as a whole there in Harris County. And then also I offer that the preservation, documentation, and support of these, telling of these sites and these stories, I offer to you that it also demonstrates our value as people. It shows our children what we value about each other. And I also offer that it shows what we value as a society. So when our global neighbors ask, what is Georgia about? We have resources that we can point to that can really demonstrate those values. Next slide. So thank you so much for your time today. The GOPIN network and steering board are endeavoring to speak for those fragile and those often forgotten resources as they work to build a better network prepared to move forward. And I offer to you that they ask you to stand with them to help them prepare to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. That was a great presentation. And as you were sort of talking through that, checking the chat for questions, but one of the things that came to mind was, as you said, the idea with advocating to tell a more inclusive story of our history is important. I was wondering, through the state, we work on, as a planning professional, right? We're working on a lot of these local comprehensive plans that tell the history of the community and as they plan for the future of the community. And I don't know if there have been conversations within the state, within DCA, about how these resources sort of get integrated into the planning work as well. And also along the same lines, if this is a resource that is being utilized or should be utilized more as communities across the state are looking at redevelopment and looking at community revitalization projects to better understand the resources that exist.
Well, this is an opportunity for me to promote the network and their steering board. Not a lot of folks know that GOPIN is out there. But in terms of integrating preservation of African-American sites and preservation overall, I've been endeavoring to connect GOPIN with the various historic preservation commissions in those 99 certified local governments around the state. Those particular commissions are required to do training, I think annually. And so fortunately, as a part of the outreach department, I have the ear of the certified local government coordinator and our program manager. And so we are working on a training that is more inclusive of information about diverse resources and about GOPIN as a resource for those commissioners as well. And so again, with more promotion, more engagement and interactive action, we're hoping that the word kind of gets out. Once this particular initiative supported by the National Trust completes over the next year, we hope to have online presence, social media presence to alert folks, and also have a plan for advocacy action amongst our various constituents. 5,000 is a lot of folks, and they're spread out throughout the state. And we know that advocacy before their local officials is really where the work gets done and really where the difference is made. So that's one of the focuses of this Building a Better Network initiative.
Excellent. Thanks, Melissa. Seeing no immediate questions in the chat, I'm sure we'll come back to you in the end, but I did want to thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
And I think we'll move to the last presentation that we have for have Johanna talk about the work that she's been doing with Homewise, and I think she's going to talk about a specific project as well as part of that. But Johanna, floor is yours.
Great. Let me know if I'm having any internet trouble, because it was fine until 2 seconds ago, of course. So thank you so much for having me. I am really honored to be on this panel, and I really appreciate the presentations before me. It's really exciting to hear about this great work.
I think that might have.
Am I choppy right now?
I think you're good.
Okay, great. So, I am the Senior Director of Community Development at Homewise, which is a community development finance institution in the state of New Mexico. And our core work is really enabling home ownership for residents who normally don't become homeowners. So we do that by vertically integrating the real estate process, starting with free financial education, all the way through real estate services, lending, down payment assistance for qualifying borrowers. And we really see this as a racial wealth gap strategy. And we've helped about 7,000 people to date become homeowners across the state. Our work in the community development department is very specific to working within neighborhoods to kind of straddle the line between the needs for often redevelopment in disinvested neighborhoods. So we do that through both commercial and residential redevelopment, and also the the potential negative outcome of increasing values that can come as a byproduct of that redevelopment. So we address that through anti-dissident efforts focused on increasing the home ownership and commercial building ownership rate, along their strategies, participatory planning and other strategies. So today I'm here to talk really about this specific project of the Rupee Drugstore, which was one of our first commercial redevelopment effort in the Morelos neighborhood, which is a neighborhood older than the city of Albuquerque, older than the state of New Mexico. Its Hispanic or Spanish kind of founding date marks about 350 years ago. So it's a very very kind of old community, a small, almost village that's now smack dab in the middle of the 197 square mile Albuquerque footprint. So go ahead, next slide. This was not your average drugstore. The Rupee was operational from 1883 until 2011. And over the last 30 years, the drugstore really became a site for curanderismo, which is like a traditional kind of medicine practice that spans parts of Latin America and Western America, and is pretty strongly rooted in northern New Mexico in particular. So I love this photo that I took of the holy water, because I think it's so emblematic of this unassuming place. Looking at it from the outside, you wouldn't know how important I think the activities and the events that happened inside of the building were. Next slide. The reason this conversion happened was because of this woman, Maclovia Zamora, who became part owner of the building and the business in the 1980s. Next slide. And her step grandmother had been a curandera. So in her basically retirement years, Maclovia taught herself primarily she focused on medicinal herbalism, but she did that by reconnecting with this kind of loose network of people from actually academics at UNM to practitioners all over there in northern New Mexico, to even building relationships with people in Mexico. So I think this building, there was a curandera named Felipa who would come up every year from Mexico City. So the place became also a center for this important network of traditional healers. And I think that knowledge, the knowledge that was developed and shared in that space, was a critical part of the project. Next slide, please. So we purchased the building from Maclovia in 2017. And the day, I probably won't forget the day I stepped into this building, because it felt like the doors had just been closed the day before. There were like herbs drying on the wall. It was really like stepping into the past. And I think as we move deeper into the century we're living in now, which I do think is going to be very much defined by globalization and technology, being able to experience that sense of walking into a space that had been this continuous small business for over 100 years, and the way that felt like stepping into the past, that felt really important to figure out how we preserve that. So I started thinking a lot, not only about how do we focus on this with an eye not only on historic preservation of the building, but also thinking about this broader concept of cultural preservation. And it's so great to hear other people's presentations today, because I think, having grown up particularly in Santa Fe, historic preservation focuses so much on the physical infrastructure. And so I think the field really needs to expand to thinking more about, you know, the networks of people that brought those buildings to life. So that was really part of our thinking too, which was like, how could we preserve some of the ephemera and the cultural knowledge that was born out of this really interesting work that Maclovia did here. Next slide. And how could we ensure that residents didn't experience this process as cultural erasure, but rather as a rebirth of the building that carried on the feeling of community and the sense of place? I love this quote because I think this idea of maintaining the characteristic features and identity of place is so important. And New Mexico is very lucky to be very rich in identity of place. So I think that it offers a lot of opportunities to think about that as a kind of North Star in the way that we do our work. Next slide. So how could we make this physical transition, which was going to be very apparent to people and very emotional for people, something that still felt like theirs, even though visually it changed? Next slide. I won't forget, I had an interesting conversation. Maclovia's son-in-law lives right behind the building. And I remember while we were doing the redevelopment of the interior, which was really just the simplest kind of redevelopment we could do, with keeping things very much in line with what they looked like before. I invited him into the building to show him around, and he said something. He said, "I don't think I'm ready for that," you know. And it was so interesting to me because as the developer, I was like, "This is taking forever," and to him, it was like this pace of change was still outpacing kind of his emotional processing of it all. And it was useful for me and instructive for me to remember that, keeping the emotional pace of change in mind is an important element of redevelopment that's culturally responsive. Next slide, please. So one of our first steps was to reach out to the National Hispanic Cultural Center, which is a great institution, actually just less than a mile south of the building. And we brought their archivist in, and they have since created, before we, had to get rid of all of what was left inside of the building, they were able to take a bunch of ephemera, a bunch of materials, and convert those into a digital archive. So there's now a digital archive of a lot of Maclovia's life and work, which I'm very pleased. I mean, when I was looking through the stuff in there were, kind of the old recipe style boxes of like prayers and medicinal herbal recipes. And I just felt sick to my stomach. Imagine just throwing all these things away. So instead of that path, which would have been the simplest, speediest path, there's now this digital archive and resource available to people. Next step. And after a few fits and starts with our leasing strategy that I won't get into, but anyone who's done development knows, commercial redevelopment, we had gotten through basically plan A, B, and C. None of them had played out. So at that point I said, let's experiment with something. Let's try leasing the other small areas in the building and keeping this large space that you see in front of you here open for community use for a year. And it will be helpful to us. We could potentially find operators. It'll be great for the community because it'll provide free programming, but it'll also activate the space in a way that I was hoping would really make people feel that this space has changed and yet it is still a community resource. Next slide. So we kicked that off with a Dia de los Muertos art event. And so it was an art event called Altar that there were about 12 artists that each built an altar in the tradition of Day of the Dead. And, you know, it was a great kind of, I think, aligned and vibrant event that showcased like, okay, we're about having community events and activities in this space. Next slide. And over the next several months, we got tons of traction on this idea. In the first month, there were events there, 27 out of 31 days. Next slide. Over the first 3 months, 1,000 people attended events there, from things like this ballet folklorico class that a resident in the neighborhood would lead several nights a week, to art events. Next slide. We had just such a wide range of events, and it was so exciting because all of this was programmed by residents, by people from the broader Albuquerque community, and all of it was free to attendees. Next slide. We had events like native film screenings. A student on the left, you see a student airing her short film series called Reservation Longing, to a retablo making workshop by a local artist that connected with the community center, the senior center. So anyways, just a real breadth of activities. And it was kind of very affirming that that this experimental approach with a little bit of like tech savvy, we just put a website out there. People could sign up through the website. It really unleashed this kind of pent up demand and creativity from residents. Next slide. Oh, actually, Molly, would you cue up the video? I wanted to show a short 2-minute or less video of one of the events to give a real flavor of what was going on there. Thanks, Molly. Go back to the presentation. So everything was going swimmingly, and then COVID hit. But we didn't give up. We just continued with a variety of outdoor placemaking activities, digital. We kept at it. You see a poetry reading here in the early pandemic days, like the summer. Next slide. And eventually we got to a leasing strategy with Secret Gallery, which was one of the people that was really heavily involved in the activation phase. So now the space has been converted, the front space has been converted to a gallery retail space that's primarily representing artists of color. Next slide. Hosting community events, and I think generating actual economic development for a broad range of people. So these artists, Frank Blasquez and Jody Herrera, had a show in July, and they sold over $8,000 worth of work. So, you know, there are real economic impacts also coming out of this approach. Next slide. And I think, you know, what we're really excited about is that there's kind of an ongoing cultural thread that feels like it is linking what was there before with what it is now. Next slide. And the next, please. However, this is done, you know, this takes money. So to come crashing into the reality of how we've done this, we've basically subsidized this. You know, I'll be totally honest. We've this project is about $630,000 in. There's some, we're still spending a few $1,000s, so we haven't spent quite all of this yet, but we got a broker's price opinion on the project recently. It was valuated at $260,000, which is $10,000 more than what we bought it for. And we are losing money, and we're subsidizing that because we're a really strong and financially healthy organization. And I would argue that the $20,000 that we project losing in the first 2 years is well worth, is actually a small investment for how the community has experienced this and the economic development impacts that this has had. You know, I think we will get to a point where we're making a modest, very modest return on this investment. But it's not something that can be done at scale if it's expected that developers or organizations are gonna subsidize all of these costs. So I do think that it's something that begs for conversation around. We've found good ways to subsidize the historic preservation of buildings. How do we think about subsidizing the preservation of the connections, the cultural connections that exist inside of those buildings, right? Last slide, please, Molly. Yeah, I mean, I think growing up in Santa Fe, I've often felt like historic preservation has been at odds with actual community and cultural preservation. You know, so much of the east side of Santa Fe, areas that were once 90% Hispanic are now 10% Hispanic. Those homes are often fetch $1 million, and it looks exactly the same, but the entire sense and feel of the community that was there, you know, when I was a kid, but especially long before that, is gone. And it's not that neighborhoods can't change. Of course they change all the time. But how do we, especially as the rate of change increases, keep some pace with that allows neighborhoods to move through that process with the sense of resiliency and connection. So I end with this slide because I think this is really what we're going for. I feel like we're under Maclovia's watchful eye on this project, and I try to make sure that we are kind of in line with keeping that bit of the past into the future. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Johanna. That was fantastic. And I have a whole host of questions, and I'd say at this point, if you have questions specifically to what Johanna spoke to, please put that in the chat. And if you have questions for Melissa or Blake and Doug as well, please do that here. The one thing I sort of wanted to sort of ask Johanna is specifically to this project is, was there a conversation as you were heading into this about, is it just simpler to just get rid of the building, put something up that's a lot more higher density or whatever, it might be better use, that is just easier for you to redevelop the property? Did you have to fight any of that as part of this, or did you sort of get this at a time in the community's history where it wasn't feeling that pressure? And so is timing key to something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's so interesting to hear Doug talk about kind of resisting Atlanta's future forward branding. I would say we have the opposite problem in New Mexico. We are always looking backwards. So I wouldn't say that there's ever a lot of pressure to go higher density and to do more kind of ambitious development projects. It's starting in Santa Fe because the affordable housing crisis is so significant at this point. And home values in Albuquerque have gone from median 170 to 240 over the last 3 years. So I think there's going to be some amount of pressure moving forward, but no, I think it was always universally kind of desired that we find some way to keep this cultural treasure in line with its past use. But how to do that without just returning to the past, which I think was kind of the idea that so many folks presented as an option in so many words, was the real trick. And I think continues to be, like, how do you have guideposts that help you move forward in a way that feels culturally relevant without being overly prescriptive?
Right. Right. And I think there's a question in the chat related to this, which is, do you feel like the neighborhood is being gentrified, and are the legacy residents beginning to be displaced, or
You know, there's been a lot of conversation about gentrification in Albuquerque for many years, particularly in this neighborhood, because it's adjacent to downtown and adjacent to a 24-acre development project that has essentially been stalled for years. And in reality, it's disinvestment that has been pushing residents out. So from 2000 to 2010, about 5% of the neighborhood, there was a 5% population loss in the neighborhood. And that's really because people, there's safety issues, there's a lot of challenges. So for when I started, I felt like everyone wants to talk about gentrification when in reality, what's causing people immediate problems is disinvestment. That said, the pandemic has obviously affected real estate markets everywhere, and Albuquerque is no exception. Rents have increased 8% citywide over 2020. In Albuquerque, it's in top 10 cities of rental increases. So I do think, especially in these older historic neighborhoods downtown, they are now actually kind of there's still viability and a path towards ownership. So the median rent rate in the neighborhood right now is still what you would pay in a mortgage with our down payment assistance. So there's still a path for people to achieve ownership. But I do think that, yeah, values are going to continue to increase. And, you know, commercial buildings in particular, I think don't get enough of the focus in the conversation about gentrification. That about 50% of the buildings on this main street in this neighborhood are owner occupied, which is great. It's also makes their business model make more sense because they're open 2 days a week. So I think they're like completely paid off. And we are working now to develop a commercial loan product. We just helped a tattoo business owner buy a building that had been vacant for 10 plus years in the neighborhood, because we see commercial ownership as a really important anti-gentrification tool as well.
Right. And you know, to that end, there is, I mean, Homewise is obviously actively involved and is you know, you talked a lot about the different programming aspects. It's not just about the physical preservation, but it's about the events and the way you talk about and you preserve the history. How do you sustain that? Like, is the idea that's Homewise is there and this is who leads that, and how does that sustain in the long run?
That's the tough question. I mean, our department has existed for 2 years. So I think what we're really trying to determine right now is what is the right tools and strategies for a responsive community redevelopment approach that we can open source for people, and how do we figure those things out to the point that then we can share them more broadly. I think you're always between a rock and a hard place when you're trying to have a triple bottom line approach. So I think that in general, if we want to create free programming and free access for community members in a period of redevelopment for some of the commercial spaces that we redevelop, that's worth the cost of it. And that money has to come from somewhere. So that's a big question mark that I don't know the answer to. You know, I mean, our goal is to get to a 5% rate of return on these projects, a very modest rate of return. And I think it's achievable. But I think there's a bigger question of how do you get the leadership of this approach so that there's more community leadership and there's more public leadership. And I think there's lots of public-private partnership opportunities here. We did receive some funding for activation phase from the city of Albuquerque because they were looking at that as a public safety strategy, which is really, really high priority in Albuquerque. But yeah, I would say we have that part of the plan completely hashed out yet.
All right, thanks, Johanna. Any other questions in the chat? All right, I'm not seeing anything yet. And Doug and Blake and Melissa, feel free to sort of chime in if you have thoughts on this too, because as we explore sort of this unique model that speaks to, I think, historic and cultural preservation, what are your thoughts on something like this already occurring in the city of Atlanta or across the state, or having more opportunities to do something like this.
I'll just say one thing real quick, and then I think Melissa wants to jump into one of the things I'll note from a city staff person, the government agency kind of person, is that our historic preservation ordinance does allow for protection due to cultural significance. The two challenges we've had with that, and we're sort of getting into that more, and that's been the case actually since the 1980s when the ordinance was established. The two challenges I think we're sort of grappling with there is the cultural significance idea of that in the general public is relatively new. And so, as we've tried to sort of tiptoe into that area, we have to make sure people understand that it's actually allowable to do that, among other things. And then secondly is that we still, because we live in the space of a planning area, right now our tool still deals with the physical place. Like we have to have a place to tie the culture to say, this building or this place is associated with this culture, and thus the building or place should be retained. But we're starting to have conversations in the city of Atlanta that relate to how to use, how to blend, I guess, sort of zoning tools and economic development tools that sort of might be linked somehow. One of the projects we're just starting here in the city of Atlanta is in the investigation of a legacy business program that really is focused on the historic preservation side of it all, but really, of course, would very quickly get into economic development and funding and all those kind of things. So yeah, that's my quick thought on that.
Thanks,
That's really exciting.
Yeah, I know that in the city of San Francisco, I think it was 2015, 2016, that they established a legacy business ordinance that gave those businesses tax breaks in order to ease off some of the effects of the increasing property values and development pressures that were coming to the Chinatown area, forcing those particular businesses to make those hard choices as to whether they would stay or go. But when I think about, cultural resiliency, I can't help but just think about the people, because while we definitely do want to tie people's perception of culture to places in order to help support the preservation of those places, ultimately the culture is embodied in the people. As you showed, Johanna, in your video, people dancing and celebrating and commemorating and remembering ancestors, the people themselves is what brought that cultural observance to life. And so I always think about the subsidies, as you mentioned, what effort goes into to stabilizing and preserving the human resources in the community before the purchase of the building, before the cleaning out of the building, to put those particular stakeholders, actually make them more stable and secure in that particular community, so that longtime legacy residents are there, when this redevelopment actually starts and heats up. So that's always my first thought. And it requires, a lot of foreplanning, because you have to do a large amount of engagement and informing and trust building with legacy residents, especially with African-American communities around this state. I'm from the coast, and in the Gullah Geechee community, they don't know you, the conversation is not going to start. And so there has to be that kind of that commitment in long-term planning of engagement and bringing subsidies and other resources and partners to the table to do what's necessary to really stabilize the people that embody the culture, so that this wave, they can bounce back. They are resilient from this wave of investments, this economic round of investment. And I mentioned the Gullah Geechee corridor, and I'm sure most of you all being here from Georgia know the development pressure that they're facing on the coast as snowbirds come from Canada, and other newbies or cumyas, as we call them, come to build their, winter homes on the coast. And that particular horse is out of the barn because, we kind of were asleep at the wheel in terms of doing the necessary policy changes and instituting the necessary ordinances in order to make sure that Gullah natives who lived on these barrier islands for hundreds of years are allowed to stay and live out their culture. That is what makes Georgia one of the more attractive places to visit. It's Gullah Geechee culture. It's the infusion of African and African American culture that makes the South, in my opinion. So I know I'm rambling on, but my biggest thought is just really starting ahead of the game and really engaging people and engaging local officials, getting the policies and those protections in place, and making the commitment to subsidize as necessary in order to keep people in place who embody the culture. So thank you for letting me ramble.
That was not rambling. That was all great, Melissa. Thank you. So I know we're at time. So I did want to sort of thank Melissa, Blake, Doug, Johanna for being with us today. I definitely took a lot away from it. I know the folks that are on this call, which is a lot of local governments and our nonprofit partners and even consultant community, probably learned something and hopefully can take back to their practice or to their community. So it definitely did fire me up for the work that we have ahead of us as ARC to work on the small business anti-displacement guide that we're trying to work on. But again, I wanted to thank you all for sharing all the great resources and the information that you have and spending the morning with us. So I believe that's the end of today's meeting. And unless I'm missing something else, which Molly would have told me by now, I think we're adjourned for today. So thanks for joining us, everyone.
Sam, the date change for the next LUCC.
That's right. Yes. And Molly, do you have the information on that? That is, the next LUCC meeting that we're having is not going to be on the traditional last Thursday. Instead of that, we are moving it to
the 25th. Jared, confirm that for me. And I will also send this out in an email to you all. So you will have this in writing in our follow-up email, but I believe it's the 25th.
Yes, we decided to give everyone an early start for Memorial Day holiday.
Yes.
Including ourselves. So, all right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.